If you're making a meal and you're cooking, you don't want children in the kitchen, just because even when you're drinking hot tea, sometimes the water doesn't have to be that hot. And sometimes children will go, especially if they're crawling, they'll pull the tablecloth, and then you have hot tea or hot water or hot chocolates spilling all over the child and increasing the risk for burns. Hello everybody, I'm here to talk about burns today. And there's a lot of things that predispose children to having burns. And we're going to talk about a few of those today. Now, did you know that in the United States, there's actually laws to protect children from getting burnt? Most homes have their heaters set at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature is set so that if you ever put the hot water on in the bathroom or in the kitchen or in your sinks, it gets hot, but it never gets hot enough to burn you. And those laws were set in place when they found out that a lot of children were getting burned because the water heaters were too hot. Now, in Nigeria, there's no rule or regulation about how high the water heaters should be. And we do like to drink a lot of hot tea and hot chocolate, or we like to do the Indomie noodles. All over the world, people like to eat the ramen noodles or Indomie noodles, as it's popularly called in Nigeria. And that increases the risk, especially if people are using microwaves to make those kind of foods. The other thing is when we have maybe if we don't have a working water heater in the bathroom, we boil water inside hot kettles, and then we're transferring the hot water in the hot kettle from one destination, which is usually the kitchen, to the restrooms or to the bathrooms. I usually tell parents, rather than transfer hot water in a hot kettle, put some cold water in a bucket, fill it like 1/3 full, pour your hot water in the bucket, and take it to the bathroom if you want to bath your child. Because if by accident on the way you slip and fall, whoever is carrying that hot kettle of water or whoever is in contact with that hot water can get burnt. And there's really no reason to get burnt. If you're making a meal and you're cooking, you don't want children in the kitchen, just because even when you're drinking hot tea, sometimes the water doesn't have to be that hot. And sometimes children will go, especially if they're crawling, they'll pull the tablecloth, and then you have hot tea or hot water or hot chocolates spilling all over the child and increasing the risk for burns. So we've had a few children come in the US where families were cooking in the kitchen on the floor. And for whatever reason, maybe there was a barbecue going on but for whatever reason, the risks are just too high. So make sure that children don't have access to the kitchen, especially when there's a lot of food cooking going on, and hot grills, hot stoves, hot kettles. Now, when children get burnt, what is the first thing that we need to do? That is not the time to get butter and put any kind of buttery agent on the skin. The first thing you want to do is remove the child from that heating source. So if the child is in contact with a flame, roll that child on the floor or put a blanket to stop the fire from burning the child. If the child is in contact with hot water, take those clothes off as quickly as possible and put the child under cold water. The cold water stops the burning of the skin and stops the burn from getting further or getting worse. We're just going to talk about simple burns, as in burns from things in the home. Of course, as adults, a lot of adults can get exposed to chemical burns depending on if they're working in a lab or if they're in construction and there's all kinds of asphalt and all kinds of hot regions that people work with in their workplaces. That's beyond the scope of this talk. So we're just talking about simple burns for children in the home. So most times a child will be exposed to a flame, fire in the kitchen, or if there's a fire in the house. When there's fire in the home, that is a whole different scenario. You want to, of course, call 911, call the fire department. And if it's a kitchen fire, if you have those blankets, fire blankets that you can use to cover the stove, that snuffs out the oxygen that's flaming the fire, and that stops the fire from getting worse. If you have hot oil that has splashed and there's a fire, put a lid over the oil containing container, and that stops the fire also. So once the child has been burnt, you want to expose them to cold water or even ice. Get an ice pack, put it on the area that has been burnt, but rinse off the liquid or the soup or whatever it is that burned the child in cold water. Don't use hot water, don't use butter, and that will help first of all. And then there's actually a way that we calculate the percentage burns of children, and we'll show you that diagram during the course of this talk. But when children have a very high percentage of burns on their body, then they definitely need to be seen in the nearest emergency room. You need to take them to the nearest urgent care or pediatric facility so that they can get the care that they need. We do worry that if a child has been in a fire or there's been smoke in the home, we worry about inhalational injuries. So those children need to be on oxygen when they get to the hospital. Once you have a fire in the house, you don't want to go to any urgent care or doctor's office. Go straight to the emergency room because your child could be at risk for smoke inhalation, and that is by itself can cause a lot of problems. Not to talk about methemoglobin, just inhaling carbon monoxide or any other fumes that could be toxic to your child. So please go to the nearest emergency room if there's been a house fire. Now, for the simple burns of the extremities or simple burns of any part of the body, if it's not a big percentage of the body, we usually tend to clean those wounds, those burn wounds, in the urgent care or in our doctor's facility, in our hospital. We clean those wounds, and we usually like to use bacitracin ointment or antibiotic ointment for the burns. If it's simple burns, remember there's 3 types of burns. There's the 1st degree, 2nd degree, and 3rd degree burns. Depending on the degree that the burn is, if the burn is superficial, kind of like sunburn, for instance, is when the skin is red and it doesn't, that's like the superficial layer of the epidermis. That's a 1st degree burn. Sunburn is one of those kind of burns. That usually tends to be very mild, and just putting a cold compress on the skin helps. Taking pain medicines help, like your Tylenol or your Motrin, and those usually heal very quickly within a week to 10 days. 2nd degree burns is when you have blisters of the skin, and a lot of those burns can be very painful because that's like the epidermis and part of the dermis, which is like a deeper layer of the skin. And when you have blisters and those blisters pop, it can be very painful when the skin comes together, and those children are in a lot of pain because you have a lot of pain fibers in the epidermis and dermis. The 3rd degree burns, sometimes the skin looks white. It's like there's a full thickness burn of the skin, and sometimes those don't even hurt because it has burned through the pain nerves. And those burns need to be evaluated and treated by a burn specialist because the skin might never be the same again after a 3rd degree burn. So once you remove the heat source that caused the burns, you want to put some ice or cold compresses on the skin, and you want the child to be seen by the doctor as soon as possible. And just make sure that you follow all the recommendations that's been given by the doctor to make sure that the burns heal very well. Sometimes when the skin is broken, remember that the skin it covers the vital organs of the body. When you have a break in the skin, bacteria can go in there, and anytime you have a burn, there's a risk for secondary bacterial infections. Pseudomonas is one of those bacteria that we see when there's been burns. So if your child has had extensive burns, they need to be in the hospital most times because there's a risk of dehydration because they've lost a lot of fluid from the burn site. They might need to be on IV fluids, IV antibiotics, but that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But once you have a child who's had a burn, please remove the offending agent, put your child's extremity in cold water, and see your physician. There's certain burns that are associated with abuse, especially when we start to see glove and stocking distribution. If a child has been submerged into hot water as a form of abuse, depending on distribution of the burns. Like if there's gloves, like both hands have been submerged inside hot water, both hands would be like gloves, as if you had like a glove distribution of burns in the hand. Or like you're wearing socks and there's burns in those areas of the legs, those are signs of abuse. And usually families that come in with those kind of burns, we have to get social services and the Department of Children's Health involved, because they will need to investigate for a form of abuse for those children. But generally, when children have burns, especially if it's first or second degree, they heal very well and everybody's happy. But do take those precautions that we talked about earlier, just to make sure that your child is not at risk of having burns. And if you like to drink your hot tea, please drink it when your child is sleeping or when your child is not around, or at least make sure that the drink is not accessible to your child, just so that they don't end up spilling it or splashing it all over their bodies. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and send it to our social media handle. And if you can subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more information, we'd appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. And this is Dr. Sanusi, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.